Hello again, fellow mystery files. Today I am discussing my thoughts on what makes a good mystery novel. I came up with 15 items that, in my opinion, elevate a mystery novel to make it superior. Now, like with my video last week, this list is in no particular order and is not exhaustive. I will also say that there are a lot of fantastic mystery novels out there that don't do many of these things or don't contain any of these things at all. These are just items that I prefer to see in a mystery novel. And I will be spoiling some novels because I will give examples, so fair warning, but I will do my best to try to avoid major spoilers. And before I get started, make sure you hit the subscribe button to keep up to date with the channel. My list is split into two groups. The first group contains 9 general topics I think elevate a detective novel, while the final 6 items are more specific plot points that I love to see. And I'll start with one of my biggest, in my opinion, and that is an expert use of the time and place settings. In my Hercule Poirot rankings, I specifically mentioned this as a reason why I love After the Funeral and Taken at the Flood so much. Christie uses the aftermath of World War II to shape the world in her stories. These two novels and many others can only happen at this very specific time in history, and we can see this in the Poirot adaptations that transport these two novels to an earlier time, and it just doesn't work as well. I'm sure we'll see shortly that there will be murder mysteries set during the COVID pandemic that make use of certain things that would only happen during that time and none other. I think in general, authors typically use the place setting well enough, like in Niall Marsh's Color Scheme, which features a murder in a mud pool, but the time element is often ignored. I think utilizing the time a novel takes place in really elevates the book and makes it feel fully realistic and often doubles as a commentary on the era. This next point might seem like it contradicts one of my pet peeves, but that is clever rule breaking. Like I said in my previous video, the rules of mystery fiction are there for a reason and they shouldn't be broken. The exception to that is when an author gives a deliberate and careful thought to doing so. I use the example of Murder of Roger Ackroyd as a novel that does this well, The Endless Night is another, so is The Finishing Stroke by Ellery Queen. I won't mention what those rules are to avoid spoilers, but there needs to be a justifiable reason for breaking said rule. It's not enough to do it just to do it. And the few novels that do pull this off well are very careful to play fair and not break other rules. And to me, the ability to achieve this is a sign of a fantastic writer who paid painstaking attention to their craft to get it just perfect. This next item applies to life in general, and that is the KISS principle, the keep it simple, stupid theory. I think another sign of a fantastic mystery author is when he or she can simply tell a story without having to resort to fancy tricks or convoluted plots, but still maintain a wonderful puzzle at the heart of the mystery. An excellent mystery novel can fill out a full length novel with no padding. Five Little Pigs is a great example of this. There's absolutely nothing going on in this novel other than the mystery itself. We're not dragged along side plots, and the mystery is a very simple one. There are a lot of moving parts, but those parts are also simple, and yet the mystery is just as deceptive and difficult to solve as any other. I think another way to put this is the less is more principle. We don't need all the fancy bells and whistles to have a fantastic mystery novel. Related to this is when an author suggests that there are limited options. I personally enjoy a novel where there are a lot of suspects and possibilities. When an author challenges his or herself, I think the outcome has the potential to be fantastic. Now, an author does run the risk of the novel becoming too obvious, but when well done, it's done superbly. Again, I would list Five Little Pigs as an example of this, but Cards on the Table is probably the most famous example. The Five Red Herrings and the Poison Chocolates case are also two very good examples, although the Five Red Herrings has other major issues, but this is something it does well. I like reading these stories because they feel like challenges the author issued to him or to herself. In each of these novels I mentioned, the author sets up the situation so that there are only a handful of possible outcomes that are clearly stated from the beginning. They trap themselves in this box and they have to write their way out of it by limiting the possible solutions. This has produced some of the best mystery novels of all time. This next point can be found across multiple books in a series, and that is when an author can reuse a plot over and over again without being noticed. Agatha Christie used murderous love triangles so many times, and yet the reader will rarely notice the similarities between these books unless he or she looks deep into it. I think this is something else that demonstrates strong writing skills, the ability to retell a story in such a way that the reader will not notice and is still fooled and still entertained. Naomi Marsh uses similar theater stories across some of her books. I think False Scent and Photo Finish are actually very similar plot wise, yet one doesn't really notice. And this one is related to keep things simple. Stick with what you know if you can pull it off well enough, and you can keep going and going with this. Now, my next thing might be somewhat controversial, but that is displaying the right amount of violence and sex. I'm not a fan of the cozy mystery, and I have a very specific definition of what a cozy is, and I wouldn't say any really golden age novel fits into that. I think if the author goes overboard, the novels become something other than a mystery novel, but if these subjects are avoided, I think the book becomes really puritanical in nature. Mystery novels are about people's deepest secrets and evil plots. There's violence and sex in these situations. I think A Vintage Murder by Niall Marsh is a good example of this. It's my least favorite Allen novel, but Marsh provides quite a gruesome description of the victim's head in such a manner that sets the tone and gets the point across without being explicitly gory. Ellery Queen novels often allude to sex in such a way that, once again, the message is received without the novel turning into more of an adult story or getting particularly graphic. Something else I appreciate in mystery novels is when the author uses all of their characters. And what I mean by this is that all of the major and supporting characters are used in some way other than just being there as a suspect. Obviously, there is the killer and the investigator, but those other innocent characters should find some part to play in the novel, whether it be a scapegoat or providing some type of important information or being the catalyst or what have you. One of my favorite Lord Peter Wimsey novels, The Unpleasantness at the Bellana Club, uses its characters very well. Dorothy Sayers makes sure each major character plays some kind of unique role and isn't just there simply to be a suspect. When authors do have characters who are just there to be suspicious and nothing else, it makes those characters feel extraneous, not fully fleshed out, and feel like they could have been completely cut from the novel to begin with. These next two items refer to how the author plants clues, and they're actually complete opposites. The first is by using in your face clues. Sometimes an author shoves a clue in your face, and the reader will ignore it. Some examples of these come from Hercule Poirot's Christmas, where we are told many times that the superintendent is very handsome and how he is constantly mistaken for other members of the Lee family from afar, and also from Niall Marsh's final curtain, where again there are plenty of mentions of how Panty isn't healing from her ringworm. I think when an author leaves their clues exposed, it's a brazen thing to do, and it often leads to success, because oftentimes the reader is looking too carefully and misses the big picture, or in the event the open clue is discovered, it is often dismissed for being too obvious or like an obvious red herring. And on the other end of the spectrum is having a good red herring. A good red herring is one that is incorporated into the main story and is not easily plucked out. It's more than just a side plot that has nothing to do with the main mystery at hand, or a character who seems suspicious or guilty but isn't. A good red herring leads the reader astray in such a way that the entire picture is completely obscured. The death of Richard Abernathy in After the Funeral is, I think, the best example of a good red herring where we are led to believe Richard Abernathy was murdered when he wasn't, and this is the foundation for the majority of the book. The book is largely a story about who would kill Richard Abernathy, but this is completely in the wrong direction. Calamity Town by Ellery Queen is another good example where there's a very obvious way to look at things, and it's easy to fall down that path, only for the solution to reveal the reader has interpreted everything wrong the entire time. A good red herring cannot be cut out from the main plot of the story and still have the novel make sense. It is part of the main plot, or at least the main focus, to hide the truth. Now, these final 6 points are all specific plots or clues I like to see in mystery novels. These first of these is word clues, and I find these to be some of the most fun clues in a mystery novel. These come in many forms. It can be printed, and oftentimes these clues are reproduced in the text, in the form of a letter or a note or whatever, and then there were none is littered with them between the letters and the gramophone recording developing the judicial theme which points to the culprit. Nick's letters in Peril at End House are another good example where it's not what's in the letters that's important, but the words that are missing from it. Lord Edgewordize has that great example of the S being torn off the letter to turn the word she into he. Agatha Christie was really an expert at these sort of things, and I do again think these are some of the more fun clues possible in a detective story. Somewhat related to this is a misunderstood conversation. And what I mean by that is not a physical mishearing of words and sentences, but rather those words and sentences being misinterpreted either from the speaker to the hearer or in some kind of large scale game of telephone. And I picked on this stories the last video, and I will use a Miss Silver novel to make up for that. In Miss Silver Comes to Stay, there is a conversation overheard by the telephone operator about one character telling another that he already called the lawyer. The operator understands this to mean the caller has phoned the lawyer about filing charges against the other person, but the context of this is that the caller has phoned the lawyer about charges against the lawyer. These misunderstandings are a lot of fun for me because the opportunities they bring. We often don't know these are misunderstandings because characters could very well be presenting what they heard through how they interpreted themselves rather than the true context, which is often missing. Death in a White Tie has another great example when Bunchy tells Alan the blackmailer mixes his bruise with poison, which is interpreted as just being a slang, but literally refers to a person who makes brews as part of their career. There are so many examples of this clue across detective fiction. It's somewhat of a staple, but they almost always deliver, and I love reading them. And I've talked about this next item a few times before, but I just love mystery plots that have unknown corpses. I find the possibilities endless here. Have His Carcass and Whose Body are two Lord Peter Wimsey novels with unknown corpses, although Have His Carcass especially resolves this rather quickly. The murder plot of The Clocks, which has other issues, is actually one of my favorite examples of this. There are so many directions an unknown body plot can go. First of all, it can really be anybody who did it in this example because the victim literally could be anyone. It could be a situation where the body really is unknown by the killer. I'm always fascinated in reading all the ways an author writes themselves out of this situation. There really aren't two novels who solve this in exactly the same manner, and that's what I love about this so much. The next plot I love to see is when they're set in an international setting. I think authors tend to put much more effort into establishing the setting when the action is set in a new location. I tend to feel the atmosphere more in international settings, or more specifically, a setting that is different than the normal place for the detective. And oftentimes, the unique setting can be used in the actual plot. Some great international mysteries are Spinsters in Jeopardy, where Alan investigates a drug ring. A lot of the more famous Christie novels are set abroad, such as Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, both of which use the setting brilliantly. Even the fictional kingdom of Averna, which first appears in Sweet Danger by Marjorie Allingham, provides the backdrop for a great story. Foreign settings feel special and they feel like more important books to me. You can tell there's often a lot of research and planning gone into the setting, and it typically pays off. The next item is the use of Chekhov's gun. And a Chekhov's gun is a trope where an item or something appears early on in the plot and it appears insignificant. It's not really considered part of the main action, but then later on in the novel, that item suddenly becomes of great importance. Everything in a good mystery novel is there for a reason. An example of Chekhov's gun would be the onion in Overture to Death, where Alan finds this onion in a teapot and it seems really random, but not much thought is given to it after its discovery, only for Alan to reveal that it is in fact a major clue. It's very satisfying at the end of the novel to realize that thing mentioned and pointed out at the beginning wasn't really useless after all. It's very easy for the reader to forget about such things. They're often spotlighted, but then ignored by the text for a while, and only the most astute readers will pick up on it. And the final thing I want to talk about is framing the guilty party. And I love this trope because it's very hard to distinguish when an innocent person is being framed and when the guilty party is drawing attention to themselves to make it look like they're being framed. Mysterious Affair at Styles is probably the most famous example of this, but there are so many others. The Finishing Stroke is a good option. As mystery readers, our senses are typically attuned to suspecting everybody, so by framing the guilty party, we don't often put too much stock and we typically assume that's never the most obvious person. And this is a good trick a lot of mystery writers use simply because you just never know. There are some twists that are fairly easy to sniff out, especially if you've seen it done before, but with framing the guilty party, it never really sticks. It's a good piece of obfuscation that I often fall for. And that is it for my 15 positive attributes that I like to see in mystery novels. Next week, I will be discussing my top 10 favorite literary detectives, so stay tuned for that. As always, make sure you like and subscribe and check out my past videos. Until next time, Mystery Files.